The first gasp of tragedy came not in a roar but in a hush, a sudden intake of collective breath that shivered through Ashbourne Manor as if the very walls mourned with the guests. Lady Eleanor's widowed heart had endured months of solitude, of quiet dinners and empty parlors, of mourning dresses and the ghost of her late husband's absence haunting every familiar corner of her once bright life. Yet nothing had prepared her for this. The delicate murmur of scandal brushing against her as she entered the grand ballroom, candles flickering against the gilded mirrors, and every eye, some sympathetic, some sharp with judgment, taking her measure. The whisper had spread before her like a poisoned wind, that a recent minor indiscretion, a misstep at a local charity, a perceived slight in conversation, had been magnified into a subtle humiliation among the county's ever-watchful elite. Eleanor held her head high, chest lifted, steps measured and precise, yet the sting of whispered censure pressed cold against her ribs. It was in that exact moment, when the world seemed poised to twist against her, that the Duke of Ashbourne first noticed her. He observed from a distance, a figure of composed authority, draped in the weight of titles, expectations, and the immovable formality of his station. The Duke had mastered the art of discretion. His life had been a sequence of decisions measured against the ledger of social propriety, each day weighed with the care of a man who feared both scandal and sentiment. And yet, in the fleeting instant of Eleanor's entrance, something in the rigid precision of his routine faltered. The sight of her poised under the subtle assault of judgment awakened a curiosity he had long denied himself, a longing to understand the strength beneath her elegant composure, the resilience behind those measured steps. Eleanor's mind, however, was elsewhere. She counted each breath as if each could armor her against the intrusive gaze of gossips, each word she might speak to preempt the sharp tongue of a careless socialite. Her eyes swept the room, catching glimmers of familiar faces, the polite nods of acquaintances, and the subtle frowns of those who had once considered her a social rival. Even in her mourning, Eleanor had cultivated grace. It was a shield as much as it was an instinct. She knew how to navigate a room, how to bend with expectation while preserving the core of her identity. Yet today that balance seemed precarious, as if every murmur carried the weight of accusation, and every polite bow might mask concealed derision. The air hummed with a tension she could almost taste, bitter and metallic, as though the room itself were a living entity, anticipating her every misstep. And misstep there was, though minor in itself, the accidental brushing of a servant's tray, the faintest tilt of teacups, a ripple that caught the attention of those eager for confirmation of their assumptions. Gasps, soft as silk, barely audible but devastating, wove their way through the assembly. Eleanor froze for a heartbeat, recognizing the danger of even this trivial accident in a society that valued perfection over humanity. Shame was not new to her. Widowhood had been a slow, persistent teacher of humility and restraint. Yet here, in the epicenter of the Ashbourne gathering, it struck sharply, a lightning bolt of vulnerability that could not be contained by etiquette or composure alone. She felt the eyes weighing, judging, some with a cruelty disguised as civility, and for a fleeting second, the walls of her carefully constructed dignity trembled. The Duke, observing silently, felt a countercurrent of something he had not anticipated. Admiration, yes, but also a protective impulse he could neither name nor resist. There was a rare honesty in Eleanor's expression, the subtle quiver of her hand as she steadied the tray, the flicker of unease behind eyes that otherwise held calm and intelligence. These contradictions drew him inexplicably closer, as though the social distance mandated by rank and etiquette could be dissolved by mere attention. Yet even as he registered the spark of intrigue, he remained at the periphery, silent and unassuming, unwilling to disrupt the rigid choreography of the ballroom, yet incapable of turning away. Eleanor's senses were heightened, every sound amplified. The faint scrape of a shoe across the polished floor, the discreet coughs and murmurs, the soft rustle of silk and taffeta, all these became instruments of attention that pressed upon her chest. She clenched her fingers, hiding them beneath the folds of her gown, aware that any outward sign of panic would invite commentary, speculation, perhaps even the cruel amusement of those who thrived on the discomfort of others. And yet, amid the storm of judgment, a curious warmth threaded through her, a subtle acknowledgement that not all eyes were critical. One figure, distant yet keen, regarded her with a patience and interest that did not seek to exploit, but to understand. In that silent observation, Eleanor sensed a narrative forming outside her control, one in which she was both the heroine and the target. The duality was intoxicating, terrifying, and alluring. Here, in this moment of near tragedy, she felt herself alive in a way solitude had never permitted. Every movement, every bow, every polite smile became a declaration of resilience, a defiance wrapped in silk and lace. The humiliation, sharp though it was, had paradoxically illuminated the strength she had cultivated in quiet hours of grief. She was both fragile and formidable, and for the first time in many months she sensed the possibility that her heart, though guarded, might be seen, acknowledged, perhaps even understood. The Duke's mind, always calculated, now swirled with conjecture. Who was this woman, capable of such dignity in the face of silent censure? What past sorrow had carved the lines of grace and endurance upon her spirit? He had witnessed pride and charm in countless social gatherings, yet Eleanor's presence was distinct. It demanded neither flattery nor concession, only recognition of her inherent worth. As he studied her, he realized the stakes were not social, nor merely political, they were profoundly personal. Something within him stirred, a question of courage and desire he had long suppressed. Could he, a man of rank and tradition, allow himself to be moved by someone whose very presence challenged the quiet rules he had lived by? And so, the ballroom continued its ritual. Laughter, music, polite exchanges, all interwoven with the unspoken judgments that shaped lives in subtle yet absolute ways. Yet within that rhythm, a quiet revolution had begun, ignited by a misstep, a glance, and the resolute heart of a widow. Eleanor, poised against the tide of scrutiny, felt the first stirrings of agency, a fragile hope that perhaps, even in a world so rigid, her spirit could claim a place not dictated by rumor or expectation. The Duke, distant yet impossibly close, understood that the narrative he had thought unyielding, the life mapped by duty, decorum, and restraint, might bend ever so slightly toward the unknown, toward the extraordinary. By the time the final notes of the minuet lingered in the air, Eleanor had navigated the treacherous currents of propriety with grace, yet her pulse betrayed the inner tumult. The sting of humiliation lingered, yes, but beneath it was an ember of defiance, a quiet certainty that she would not vanish beneath whispered censure. And for the Duke, who had watched silently, admiration had taken root, growing into a promise he dared not yet voice. The world had conspired to humble her, yet in that very act, it had revealed a light he could not ignore, a light that might, in time, transform both of their lives. And as Eleanor withdrew to the quiet of a side gallery, brushing past the expectant glances and murmured commentary, the Duke's gaze followed, unwavering, a silent vow forming in the depths of his disciplined heart. He would know the woman who carried tragedy and dignity in equal measure, for she had awakened in him a question he had long forbidden himself to ask, and he was certain that the answer would change everything. The first thunderclap of misfortune struck with the sudden collapse of the Ashbourne stables, a minor accident in which a young groom had been injured, yet the incident rippled through society gossip like wildfire. The household servants whispered of negligence, and within hours the tale had reached the ears of the county elite. Lady Eleanor, already cautious after her previous humiliation, found herself dragged unwillingly into the current scandal. Not for her fault, yet ever the woman of rank, she bore the collective scrutiny with quiet fortitude. The Duke of Ashbourne, informed swiftly by a loyal steward, felt the weight of duty press upon him. His role as protector not only of his estate but of those whose virtue and reputation were entwined with it, had never seemed so urgent, so impossible to navigate. Yet beneath the calculation of duty stirred an emotion he could not name, a fierce, almost reckless desire to see Eleanor unharmed by the prying eyes of a world too eager for her misstep. Eleanor herself had no desire for public attention, for her days had been spent navigating grief and solitude, tending to charity work in small, unobserved ways. Yet now the very act of existing within the social sphere became a performance of resilience. She moved through the estate gardens, mist curling around her skirts, feeling the chill of morning rain seep into her bones, as if the world conspired to remind her of her vulnerability. Her hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the persistent, gnawing awareness that every gesture, every word, might be dissected by unseen eyes. It was in that precise vulnerability that the Duke saw her again, stepping lightly through the dew-laden grass, a figure of grace threaded with fragility. His heart, long disciplined and contained, recognized in her not weakness, but extraordinary strength, the quiet determination to persist even when the world sought to diminish her. Rumors had a cunning life of their own. By afternoon, whispers of Eleanor's supposed role in the stable's mishap had reached every parlor and drawing-room, each retelling adding embellishments and insinuations. Eleanor's cheeks, pale beneath the widow's veil, flushed with indignation that mingled with fear. She had always valued dignity over defiance, yet now she wrestled with an impulse to speak, to correct, to challenge. Such open confrontation would only fuel further speculation, yet silence gnawed at her pride. And it was precisely in this tension between self-restraint and the desire to claim her own narrative, that the Duke intervened, not with words at first, but with gestures subtle and deliberate. A letter, carefully placed within her favored book in the library, carried a poem that spoke of endurance and honor. A single white rose arrived at her windowsill, its petals unblemished, a silent testament that someone had observed her courage and admired it. Eleanor, upon discovering these tokens, felt a mixture of astonishment, relief, and cautious hope. The gestures were gentle, appropriate, yet impossible to ignore. They suggested not scandalous attachment, but a recognition of her worth, a declaration made in secrecy and respect. By the next evening, the scandal had ripened into something more insidious. The Duke's attentions, previously discreet, became fodder for social conjecture. Who was the mysterious benefactor of Lady Eleanor's books and garden blooms? Why did the Duke linger near her at the charity ball, offering the occasional smile, the briefest tilt of head? Whispered questions threaded their way through the assembly, half accented with admiration, half laden with suspicion. Eleanor, perceptive and weary, understood that visibility brought both protection and peril. Each smile from the Duke, each whispered acknowledgement of her resilience, became a delicate balancing act. The public saw propriety, she saw an intimacy threaded through civility, subtle enough to escape notice yet potent enough to ignite her curiosity. Every encounter between them, though brief and socially sanctioned, carried the weight of unspoken acknowledgement, a recognition that in a world ruled by rank and rumor, true understanding remained elusive yet profoundly compelling. The Duke's fascination deepened as he observed Eleanor navigating the storm of scrutiny. He saw in her measured steps the careful modulation of her voice, the slight stiffening of her posture when gossip brushed too close, a rare combination of vulnerability and unyielding integrity. It was in these moments that he felt the first stirring of admiration that was neither idle nor superficial, a realization that her strength was not merely in decorum, but in the resilience of spirit, the refusal to yield to the pettiness of others. His mind, trained in reason and tempered by social expectation, now wrestled with the unfamiliar, the sudden, insistent pull of affection, tempered by the knowledge that his role demanded discretion, that overt attachment could invite scandal not for him, but for her. And yet, the very act of restraining that fascination only made it more acute, more vital. He understood that to act hastily would betray both his station and her dignity, but to refrain entirely seemed equally impossible, for every token he sent, every subtle gesture, deepened his entanglement with her presence. Eleanor, in turn, felt the slow bloom of an emotion she had long believed dormant. She had mourned, yes, and in mourning had learned both caution and courage. Yet the arrival of small, carefully considered gestures, the poems, the white rose, the discreet attention, ignited a longing tempered by prudence. She knew the stakes. A widow of rank could neither be reckless nor appear easily swayed. A man of influence could not risk miscalculation, nor could she presume intimacy beyond what society permitted. And yet, the delicate tension between them, the exchange of tokens, the fleeting eye contact in the library, the quiet acknowledgement during charity work, brought a vividness to her life she had not known since before grief had reshaped her world. Each subtle smile, each word carefully modulated, became a brushstroke in a growing portrait of connection, a tentative weaving of hearts across the invisible boundaries of etiquette and expectation. The garden paths became their silent arena, the library their sanctuary. Conversations, always proper, were charged with significance. A question about a charitable initiative, a comment on a borrowed book, an observation about a stormy morning, all these became vehicles for intimacy disguised as civility. The Duke found himself savoring the rhythm of her speech, the cadence of her laughter, even the slight tension in her hands as she navigated delicate social obligations. Eleanor, for her part, experienced a renewed sense of agency, a quiet empowerment in acknowledging, if only to herself, the presence of a man who saw her complexity without judgment, who recognized both her fragility and her formidable spirit. The scandal that had begun as a minor misfortune now served as a catalyst, bringing them into proximity, guiding their interactions and heightening the emotional stakes with each carefully orchestrated gesture. By nightfall, Eleanor stood beneath the lattice of the garden, rain-washed leaves glistening like jewels in the pale moonlight. A note, delicately penned and folded, awaited her upon the bench. She opened it with fingers that trembled not from fear but from anticipation. The words within spoke of admiration and respect, of recognition for a woman who bore the weight of grief and judgment with dignity. The Duke's signature was subtle, almost hidden, yet unmistakable to her eyes trained in observation. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of wonder and caution coiling within her chest. The message was simple, yet its implications were profound. Someone of great influence had chosen to see her, to acknowledge her worth, to offer connection in a world determined to judge. And as she folded the note and pressed it to her heart, Eleanor realized that her life, long shaped by solitude and whispered judgment, was entering a chapter she had neither anticipated nor sought. The scandal, though still unresolved, had drawn her into a current far stronger than mere reputation or circumstance. The Duke's attention, at once discreet and unmistakable, promised both challenge and possibility, a question of courage, propriety, and longing she could not yet answer. And as the night air settled around her, cool and fragrant with rain, Eleanor understood that the delicate dance of tokens and whispers had begun, that her heart had been noticed, and that the path forward, though uncertain, was irrevocably altered. The boom of misfortune arrived with the sudden collapse of a servant's ladder in the Duke's private estate, a minor accident that left a young footman bruised and shaken, yet its echoes reached far beyond the hallways. Word traveled swiftly through the staff and servants' quarters, stirring unease and whispers that even the most disciplined household could not fully contain. Lady Eleanor, visiting the estate under the socially acceptable pretext of discussing charitable matters, arrived just as the murmur reached its peak. She found herself drawn into the residual tension, the air charged with both concern and quiet scrutiny. The accident, trivial in itself, became a catalyst, forcing her into closer proximity with the Duke, who had been overseeing the situation with a calm intensity that masked the storm of his own thoughts. Eleanor's entrance into the study, where the Duke had summoned the young servant to ensure proper care, was almost ceremonial. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books, the air dense with the residue of firelight and polished wood. She moved with measured steps, the hem of her gown brushing the rug, her gloves clasped delicately in one hand, her composure taut with the effort of self-control. Her eyes flicked toward the Duke, who had turned from directing the staff to meet her gaze. There was a quiet power in the way he stood, erect, commanding, yet softened by the attentiveness in his expression. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, the minor chaos of the accident reduced to background noise, as if the universe had arranged a pause for their encounter. The Duke's voice, calm but weighted, addressed her first. "Lady Eleanor, I trust you were not alarmed by the incident?" The latter's fall is a reminder of how swiftly fortune can change, even within walls thought secure. His words, though formal, carried a subtle undertone of shared vulnerability, acknowledging the fragility that both the young servant and she had witnessed. Eleanor inclined her head, her reply measured yet warm. "I was concerned only for the young man, Your Grace. Such accidents remind us of the delicate balance upon which we all tread." Her choice of words, careful and precise, hinted at the depth of her empathy while concealing the faint tremor of unease beneath her composed exterior. For the first time they spoke freely, the barriers of society's expectation momentarily suspended. The Duke, accustomed to politeness masking sentiment, found himself drawn to the cadence of Eleanor's speech, to the subtle intensity in her gaze that spoke of intelligence and endurance tempered by recent sorrow. Eleanor, in turn, noticed the quiet gravity in his eyes, the way his presence commanded attention without arrogance, the way his voice carried both authority and a rare sensitivity. In that exchange, restrained yet charged, they shared an intimacy that needed no physical proximity, no whispered confessions, yet spoke volumes of understanding and recognition. As the young servant recovered under the Duke's attentive care, Eleanor found herself lingering near the hearth, drawn not by the firelight alone but by the magnetic focus of the man who had observed her from afar for weeks. Each glance they exchanged was deliberate yet subtle, a conversation in the language of gestures, slight inclinations of head, careful modulation of tone, and the rare, fleeting softness in eyes trained to command. She sensed that he was measuring not only her reaction to the accident but the essence of her character, the resilience beneath her calm, the strength tempered by grief, the dignity maintained despite society's scrutiny. And in that measuring, she realized that he recognized the same qualities in her that she had long thought private, hidden behind widow's veils and quiet charity. The conversation shifted naturally, guided by circumstance but deepened by mutual curiosity. Eleanor spoke of her charitable endeavors, the lives she sought to improve, the small victories and disappointments that had marked her months of solitude. The Duke listened, attentive and unobtrusive, interjecting only to ask questions that revealed both knowledge and care. "You have devoted much to the relief of others," he remarked quietly. "And yet I see that in doing so, you have not lost your own resolve." Eleanor felt the compliment like sunlight through storm clouds, warming a part of her long held in shadow. She inclined her head, acknowledging the praise without vanity, and replied, "One cannot measure the impact of a gesture, nor predict the consequences of kindness. But it is the attempt that defines character, is it not?" As the dialogue continued, the atmosphere grew denser with unspoken sentiment. Their conversation skirted societal boundaries with elegance, touching on grief, duty, and courage without ever descending into impropriety. Every carefully chosen word became a bridge, connecting two lives shaped by loss and expectation, revealing compatibility deeper than circumstance alone could account for. Eleanor, once guarded and wary of male attention, found herself drawn into the orbit of a man who could see without intruding, who could admire without demanding. The Duke, for his part, felt the slow unraveling of his own restraint, a dangerous acknowledgement that her presence stirred emotions he had long denied, feelings he had deemed incompatible with decorum and station. The accident, trivial though it was, had inadvertently created a sanctuary of privacy. The study, filled with the faint scent of parchment and polished wood, with the soft glow of lamplight flickering against the walls, became a space where they could converse as equals, as human beings rather than as societal archetypes. Eleanor's defenses, long honed by grief and social expectation, softened imperceptibly in the warmth of his attention. She recognized in him a mind that could be trusted, a spirit both disciplined and capable of profound feeling. The Duke, in turn, acknowledged the vulnerability beneath her composure, a strength born of suffering and resilience, and he felt a stirring of admiration that bordered on reverence. Minutes stretched into an hour as the storm of the day receded, leaving the room cloaked in quiet intensity. Eleanor, aware of the propriety demanded by society, prepared to depart, yet a subtle reluctance held her in place, an unspoken wish to prolong the communion of understanding. The Duke, noting her hesitation, spoke softly, "Lady Eleanor, one often measures a life by its adherence to expectation. Yet I find that the courage to endure, to persist in kindness and dignity, holds a power far greater than convention permits." Eleanor met his gaze, understanding the layered meaning, an acknowledgement of her trials, an admiration of her character, and perhaps, a delicate invitation to recognize mutual regard beyond societal confines. She inclined her head, accepting both the compliment and its deeper implications. "And yet, Your Grace," she replied, "it is often in moments of quiet trial that one discovers the truest measure of character." Her words, though gentle, carried a resonance that lingered in the study, echoing off walls lined with books and polished surfaces. The unspoken acknowledgement between them hung in the air, a fragile tension charged with emotion, neither declaration nor denial, but a recognition that the lives of two solitary hearts had intersected in a manner that would change each irrevocably. As Eleanor withdrew toward the door, the Duke's hand, careful not to overstep propriety, rested briefly upon a book she had set aside, a silent gesture of connection. She paused, aware of the touch, and turned her eyes toward him. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to the warmth of shared understanding, the acknowledgement that they had crossed a threshold of intimacy forbidden by circumstance but not by the heart. And as she stepped into the corridor, the faint sound of a closing door marking the transition back to the world of expectation, Eleanor felt the first tremor of anticipation, an awareness that the bond forged in the quiet aftermath of minor tragedy might guide them both toward revelations neither yet dared to name. The boom of calamity struck with the sudden arrival of scandalous news. A letter, misdelivered and intercepted, suggested impropriety where none existed, spreading like wildfire among the county elite. By the time the Ashbourne estate received the whispers, Eleanor's reputation teetered precariously, and the delicate dance of discretion she had cultivated threatened to collapse. The ballroom, prepared for a charity gathering and society display, became a crucible of judgment, every polished floorboard reflecting the scrutinizing eyes of peers eager to witness perceived missteps. Eleanor, clad in her muted widow's attire, felt the weight of expectation pressing upon her chest, the sting of rumor sharper than any insult she had previously endured. Yet amid the tension, the Duke of Ashbourne, observing from across the room, resolved that no shadow of gossip would dictate the acknowledgement of truth or the assertion of admiration he now could no longer restrain. The music began, a stately waltz, slow and deliberate, echoing across the gilded hall, blending with the soft murmur of conversation and the subtle clink of glasses. Eleanor's heart beat with a rhythm entirely separate, a counterpoint to the composed cadence required by decorum. Each step she took through the hall, measured yet heavy with self-awareness, was a testament to her resilience, a silent declaration that whispered judgment would not dictate her presence. The Duke, approaching with the same composure that had become his shield, extended his hand in the traditional gesture of a dance, yet the energy between them rendered the motion electric, charged with layers of admiration, longing, and unspoken acknowledgement. The room seemed to fade around them, the stares and murmurs receding to distant echoes, leaving only the silent conversation carried in glances, the subtle tilt of heads, the measured placement of fingers upon one another's hands. As they moved through the waltz, Eleanor became aware of the transformation taking place within herself. The Duke's gaze, unwavering and attentive, conveyed not only recognition of her strength but also an invitation to claim a measure of freedom previously denied by grief and propriety. Each turn, each carefully orchestrated step, became a medium for communication more profound than words, a testament to the intimacy born from weeks of subtle tokens, discreet attention, and mutual respect. The scandal outside the ballroom, though unresolved, seemed to amplify the intensity of the moment. Adversity, Eleanor realized, could serve as a crucible, refining connection, clarifying desire, and revealing truths that civility alone might obscure. The dance was no mere exercise in etiquette, it was a negotiation of hearts, a silent assertion of choice in a world structured by expectation. Outside, society's whispers intensified. Observers noted the Duke's attentiveness, the almost imperceptible bow of his head toward Eleanor, the measured confidence in the way he guided her through the steps. Speculation ignited, spreading rapidly from parlor to gallery, each recounting of the dance adding nuance and exaggeration. Yet Eleanor remained steadfast, attuned only to the presence of the man whose acknowledgement had transformed what had begun as humiliation into the genesis of hope. She understood the stakes. Public attention could be perilous, rumors could shift perception. Yet the subtle assertion of agency within the confines of propriety allowed her to navigate the treacherous waters without surrendering dignity. Each step, each gentle touch of hand upon hand, became a declaration of autonomy, a silent rebellion against the suffocating grip of societal expectation. The Duke, for his part, felt a rare and exhilarating liberation. He had long been bound by the dictates of duty, by the precise expectations of estate management, social observation, and familial legacy. Yet Eleanor's presence, her resilience in the face of gossip and adversity, stirred within him emotions that had been dormant, disciplined, and carefully contained. Admiration gave way to something deeper, something that required action, required the assertion of truth and the courage to stake claim not in ostentation but in integrity. As they completed a series of turns, glances meeting across the floor, he recognized that words must follow the unspoken conversation they had cultivated. Subtle tokens, furtive acknowledgments, and carefully measured gestures had prepared them for this moment, and now the time for hesitation had ended. In a quieter corner of the ballroom, where the candlelight softened and reflections in the polished mirrors multiplied their presence, the Duke spoke for the first time amid the throng. His voice, low but deliberate, carried both respect and sincerity. "Lady Eleanor, it seems fortune and rumor conspire alike, yet I cannot allow whispers to dictate the measure of character I see before me. Your courage, grace, and integrity merit acknowledgement beyond mere discretion." Eleanor's breath caught at the sincerity in his tone, at the weight carried in measured words chosen not for flattery, but for recognition. Her response, equally restrained yet intimate, acknowledged the acknowledgement itself, a subtle admission that she had felt, understood, and valued his regard. "Your Grace, the judgment of others often weighs heavily upon the heart, yet there are moments when recognition from a singular discerning eye restores what fear seeks to obscure." Their exchange, though brief, conveyed more than volumes of conversation could capture. In the interplay of restraint and revelation, both hearts felt the tremor of connection, the recognition of affinity beyond circumstance. Yet society's gaze remained relentless. The whispered conjectures, the curious glances, and the subtle nods of the assembled elite served as a constant reminder that public acknowledgement, however measured, was perilous. Eleanor, acutely aware of the potential consequences, balanced pride and prudence, weighing the allure of connection against the ever-present demand for propriety. She realized that while the Duke's attention brought warmth and validation, it also carried risk, a delicate tightrope between intimacy and scandal. And in that understanding, the emotional stakes intensified. Every gesture, every glance, every carefully modulated word became a negotiation, a testament to both courage and discretion, shaping the evolving narrative of their intertwined lives. The dance concluded with a final deliberate turn, and the Duke offered a subtle bow, his hand lingering near hers in a gesture that spoke of protection, admiration, and restrained longing. Eleanor inclined her head, acknowledging the significance without surrendering autonomy, and a shared glance, brief yet infinitely meaningful, sealed the moment. The room, alive with music, gossip, and expectation, seemed momentarily suspended, the culmination of weeks of tokens, gestures, and silent observation crystallizing in a heartbeat of understanding. In that instant, both recognized the truth they had long skirted in civility. Their connection, forged through adversity and subtle communication, could no longer remain confined to whispers and glances alone. As the music waned and society's attention shifted, Eleanor withdrew toward the gallery, her heart both buoyed and cautious. She understood the implications of the Duke's acknowledgement. Admiration had become something more, a foundation upon which trust, intimacy, and potential love could be constructed. Yet the scandal, the rumor, the precarious judgment of society, still lingered like a shadow along the corridors of propriety. And as she glanced back at the Duke, who remained poised yet impossibly intent, she realized that the journey ahead demanded courage, discretion, and a willingness to navigate both desire and expectation. The evening, though concluding in ceremony, left a resonance that neither could ignore, a promise that the unfolding connection between them would challenge convention, test restraint, and awaken emotions neither yet fully comprehended. And in that suspended moment, as Eleanor's silhouette moved through the distant shadows of the gallery, the Duke's gaze followed unwavering, and a subtle tension coiled between them, fragile yet indelible, signaling that the resolution of longing, propriety, and mutual recognition remained tantalizingly incomplete, a question poised to transform both their lives in ways the heart alone could fathom. The boom of misfortune arrived as a sudden letter, delivered with cruel precision, bearing tidings that threatened to sunder the fragile progress of hearts long tested by circumstance. A distant relative, influential and exacting, had questioned the propriety of Eleanor's association with the Duke, insinuating impropriety where only respect and mutual admiration existed. The whisper of scandal spread swiftly, as if carried by the very wind that swept across Ashbourne's sprawling grounds. Eleanor read the letter in the quiet of her chamber, hands trembling slightly, heart constricting with the fear of judgment and the possibility that the connection she had cultivated might be severed before it had fully formed. The tragedy of circumstance, the relentless scrutiny of society, the fragile nature of reputation, loomed large, threatening to undo weeks of carefully nurtured understanding and restrained affection. The Duke, apprised of the challenge, faced the situation with a rare mixture of resolve and vulnerability. His life, carefully ordered by duty, expectation, and the dictates of lineage, had never demanded such a balance of courage and subtlety. To act with overt defiance risked scandal, yet inaction risked losing Eleanor to the weight of social pressure. He considered every avenue, every carefully measured step, knowing that the stakes were not merely propriety, but the delicate, burgeoning connection they had cultivated in stolen glances, whispered conversations, and tokens of admiration. He resolved that action must be taken, but that it must be measured, dignified, and respectful, preserving both Eleanor's honor and the integrity of their growing bond. Eleanor, meanwhile, wrestled with the tension between desire and prudence. She had long navigated the treacherous currents of expectation, yet the intensity of her connection with the Duke had awakened feelings she had thought dormant, embers of hope kindled by gestures both subtle and profound. The letter's insinuations, though unjust, forced her to confront the vulnerability inherent in accepting admiration and perhaps love from a man of such rank. Her mind replayed their dances, their shared moments in the study, the tokens of respect and subtle acknowledgement, and she realized that the risk of scandal was eclipsed by the magnitude of what she had come to feel. Courage, she understood, required action as well as restraint, and her heart urged her to confront both the relative and the societal expectations with honesty, dignity, and resolve. The resolution began in the garden, where early morning mist clung to the dew-laden paths, and the first fragile light of dawn shimmered across petals and hedges. Eleanor, walking with measured grace, encountered the Duke near the fountain, its waters reflecting a sky tinged with pink and gold. The air was sharp with freshness, carrying the scent of wet earth and blooming roses, yet the tension between them was as palpable as the chill that brushed their faces. He greeted her not with formalities, but with a quiet intensity, eyes fixed upon hers, conveying the weight of admiration, respect, and burgeoning love. She understood at once that this moment, set apart from the gaze of society, would determine the course of their shared future. "Lady Eleanor," he began, voice low yet resolute, "the insinuations of others seek to diminish what we have forged through patience, observation, and understanding. Yet I will not allow the misjudgment of distant voices to dictate the measure of my regard. You have shown courage, wisdom, and resilience in circumstances that would have undone many. I ask only that you trust me as I trust in the truth I see in you." His words, deliberate and sincere, carried the weight of both authority and vulnerability, an acknowledgement of their equality in spirit despite the disparities imposed by rank. Eleanor felt her chest swell with a mixture of relief, admiration, and the tentative thrill of hope. She responded with equal composure, though her voice carried the tremor of emotion she had long restrained. "Your Grace, the judgments of society have tested my resolve and my patience. Yet in your recognition, in the sincerity of your regard, I find both solace and courage. I have long measured my steps against expectation, yet I now see that integrity and heart must guide my actions. If we are to navigate these waters together, it must be with honesty, dignity, and mutual respect." The dialogue, restrained yet intimate, allowed a mutual acknowledgement that neither had declared before, that the connection between them was no longer a private curiosity but a shared bond, tempered by adversity and strengthened by respect. The Duke, emboldened by her response, reached for her hand, not in possession but in partnership, the gesture deliberate, protective, and intimate without impropriety. Eleanor allowed her fingers to rest lightly against his, sensing the affirmation in the warmth of his touch, the solidity of his presence. In that moment, the fragile tension of weeks of subtle gestures and whispered acknowledgments crystallized into a quiet certainty. Their hearts had found recognition in one another, and though the world might impose barriers, the bond forged through adversity could not be undone. The garden, mist-laden and serene, became a sanctuary in which their emotions could exist freely, shaped not by rumor but by understanding, courage, and the deliberate choice to honor one another. Yet the resolution was not without consequence. Society, with its relentless scrutiny, would continue to observe, to whisper, to measure propriety against connection. Eleanor and the Duke, aware of the potential for misjudgment, understood that their journey required not secrecy, but the careful navigation of expectation and decorum. They were bound by recognition, not merely attraction, by admiration tempered with respect, by courage fortified by integrity. And in that delicate balance, they found the possibility of a love that could endure both rumor and circumstance, that could transform hardship into intimacy, and that could render the judgments of others secondary to the truth recognized between two hearts. As dawn light filtered through the mist, illuminating the dew-soaked paths and petals glistening with delicate radiance, Eleanor and the Duke stood together in silent acknowledgement. Words had been exchanged, emotions laid bare with restraint and dignity, and a foundation had been established that promised continuity, care, and mutual devotion. The tragedy that had opened the day, the whisper of scandal and the threat of misunderstanding, had been met not with panic or submission, but with courage, wit, and the deliberate assertion of integrity and love. Their hearts, aligned yet tempered by circumstance, had forged a bond both resilient and profound. And as they turned toward the path leading back to the estate, the faint glimmer of sunlight breaking through lingering mist, Eleanor felt a stirring of anticipation, a recognition that the journey ahead, though tempered by expectation and societal scrutiny, held possibilities yet unseen. The Duke's hand remained near hers, a promise of steadfast attention, a quiet vow that their connection, forged through adversity, would guide them forward. And as the distant echoes of estate activity drifted faintly through the morning air, Eleanor realized that the resolution of rumor, the acknowledgement of admiration, and the emergence of hope were only the beginning. The next steps, though uncertain, were poised to transform both their lives in ways as inevitable as the rising sun.